And hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on digital literacy, access, and ethical participation. This is day 2. Some of you were here yesterday, and some of you are here for the first time today. But we're having this session thanks to Dr. Uh, Jacqueline Caulfield, who I will give the floor to in a few seconds to introduce to us the presenter of today. Jacqueline, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who were with us yesterday, thank you for joining us again. We hope to see you ongoing over the next couple of weeks. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Digital Humanities Series Day 2, and to be here with students and faculty from the University of Lomé, as well as colleagues from the U.S. Embassy in Togo. My name is Dr. Jacqueline Caulfield, and I'm here as an American scholar committed to cross-continental international exchange and intellectual exchange. This series is grounded in dialogue between institutions, between disciplines, and between global academic communities. It is especially meaningful to be presenting this work with and for the Togolese Academy. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the Department of Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Lomé and to the faculty in the Department of Anglophone Studies at the University of Lomé for the invitation and care and the thoughtful preparation that made this residency possible. I am truly grateful for the generosity extended to me upon my arrival, and I'm thrilled to be in community with such dedicated scholars, particularly the master's and doctoral students here whose work and perspectives are essential to the future of this field. I created the Digital Humanities Speaker Series in response to a set of persistent gaps: literacy, access, and access to means of achieving digital literacy. Too often, digital humanities is framed as a matter of tools or technology alone. This series insists that instead that digital humanities is about responsibility, about how knowledge is created, circulated, interpreted, and shared. That is why week 1 of the residency is organized around foundations. Before platforms, before tools, before AI, we begin by asking how to approach digital practice guided by a moral compass. Foundations invites us to think not only about what we can do digitally, but about what we should do and for whom. Today's session asks us to consider digital literacy not as a passive consumption, but as an active creation. The goal is not simply to access content, but to develop a critical capacity to shape it responsibly. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jessica Brody-Frank. Dr. Brody-Frank brings more than a decade of experience working across cultural heritage institutions, major institutions, digital humanities research, and digital curation. She has held leadership roles at the institutions including such as Georgetown University Library, the Smithsonian, the Academy of Motion, Picture, and Arts and Sciences, and the Adler Planetarium. She is currently serving as clinical professor and digital librarian at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she also leads the Chicago Collections Consortium portal. So we are very delighted to have you with us. Your expertise is something that we will learn so much from today. What I want you all to listen for today is not simply institutional expertise, but Dr. Brody-Frank's deep commitment to community-engaged digital humanities, particularly within museums and cultural institutions, and her attention to metadata as a site of inclusion, access, and meaning-making. Her work demonstrates how digital literacy is cultivated through relationships between people, collections, and contexts, and how international and community-centered perspectives strengthen digital practice. Today's session reminds us that the infrastructures behind digital knowledge, how things are described, organized, and made searchable, shape what can be known, and by whom. Thank you so much, Dr. Brody Fink, for joining us today, and we are just delighted. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for the inclusion in your really exciting work here. Let me see if I can get this to share. Did that pop up?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as mentioned, my name is Jessica Brody Frank. I work with the University of Illinois, Chicago. So I am based in the city of Chicago. You may hear some street noise. Our university is in the downtown area, so my apologies for any sirens that might go off. But what I want to talk today is kind of coming from cultural organizations. So those encapsulate the libraries, archives, and museum spaces. So cultural organizations are spaces for discovery, innovation, interrogation, but they're also encouraging agency and exploration, not only of objects, but also the very missions of our organizations. So what I want to talk about is that by adopting a mission around using our collections items in conjunction with crowdsourcing projects and programming to expose digital literacy concepts like bias, algorithms, and more, our institutions have a new ability to become essential to lifelong learning geared towards this second quarter of the 21st century. So, cultural heritage organizations like libraries and museums have always been sites of negotiated and often contested authority. And as such, they're uniquely situated as trusted information sources that can address literacy skills like bias detection and mitigation, as well as fact checking, prompt writing, questioning, and understanding of cultural impacts. One of the most basic and iconic functions of a museum is the exhibition. The fulfillment of a museum's mission to disseminate knowledge about its collection has traditionally been based upon the exhibiting function. So one thing that defines an exhibition in the modern museum, and this comes from the International Council of Museums, over that of something like the Wunderkammern of the 17th century, is that today we expect there to be an educational narrative. There's a curator or a team of curators who are there to interpret the objects for our guests and present a story. The active display is in effect a weighted decision of what to value, not only in what gets put on display to the public, but also in how we describe it. Now, when we come from a museum, we can also look at archives, because archives are also created through appraisal. It's the work of an archivist to conduct and the decision making of around 2 to 5% of what an entire institution's papers and data are deserving of preservation. And just as museums and archives have struggled with language and authority in providing access to their collections, and access that the public expects, especially now in a digital space, libraries also have been accused of limiting representation, and in turn limiting retrieval based on biased systems of classification like the Dewey Decimal System. Whether it's as a curator, a librarian, or an archivist, cultural heritage organization staff is often seen as the authority within our organizations. And in many ways, museums and cultural heritage institutions in general are dependent on the trust from the public. The standing that our staff have in academic communities and the standing that our institutions have in the public's mind are what allow the assertion of intellectual authority, the command over knowledge, as authoritative experts describe what objects are. Over the last decade, cultural heritage institutions have seen a change in our access. Digital technology has drastically changed public expectations and behaviors around accessing cultural heritage collections. This is important as our online visitors are growing into a more diverse and distinct audience segment for cultural heritage organizations. And in order to serve this new audience, organizations have looked for emerging technologies to assist in making digitized and born digital collections usable and navigable. Databases are essential for storing and managing the vast amounts of collections housed by cultural institutions, including not only digital surrogates, but also all of the associated research data and metadata. Cataloging in terms of museums and libraries is essential to discovery. I like to use a quote from Tammy Lee, who runs Culture Creates in Montreal, Canada. In 2025, Tammy Lee stated that metadata needs to be seen as more than just data about data. That's the basic dictionary definition. But metadata is actually the connective tissue of the internet, the invisible layer that decides what gets seen, what gets connected, and eventually what gets left out. Cultural organizations have focused on addressing content, but as Lee points out, it's actually the metadata that has become the architecture for meaning online. It determines whether work is discoverable, connected, or in fact orphaned into invisibility. Importantly, metadata shapes not just search results, but it also trains AI. As algorithms, and as most focus on digital literacy has revolved around these algorithms, it's a unique opportunity for cultural heritage organizations, those with collections, to focus now on the importance of metadata. Where algorithms exist downstream in the information access process, metadata is the upstream leverage point, the layer where meaning, context, and authority get defined in the first place, and therefore it's a place of power. Despite its nearly daily appearance in the news and conversation in 2025, digital literacy is a relatively new concept that emerged in the 1990s during the era of rapid internet revolution. As digital technology became more common, portable, and affordable, digital participation and online presence has increased dramatically in the last 30 years. But understanding of the technologies doesn't come from long-term use of the technology itself. It requires intervention and instruction. Traditionally, literacy has been a synonym for skill, competence, or proficiency. And though initially viewed as a set of functional skills and competencies needed to use a computer and the internet, digital literacy has expanded in the last decade to consider broader capacity needed to participate in digital environments online. And perhaps most helpful is a definition that comes from JISC, which is a nonprofit organization and UK digital data and technology agency, which defines digital literacy as the capabilities which fit someone for living, learning, and working in a digital society. Today, our problems are multifaceted. First, there's something called the digital divide. This is the unequal access to the internet and internet-connected devices like smartphones, tablets, and computers. As I mentioned, I'm based here in Chicago, so a lot of my facts will come from the United States, but these are seen throughout the world. Now, according to the Pew Research Center, 24 million Americans lack access to fast internet, and 15% of Americans are what they call smartphone dependent, which means the only device they reliably can use to access the internet is their smartphone. Lower income households, younger people, and Black and Hispanic individuals are most likely to be smartphone dependent. And this poses a lot of challenges for navigating the world, from completing schoolwork to job applications to even applying for benefits and services. It's all required to be done online, and for a large group of people, about 15%, that must be done on a smartphone. In addition, cell phone coverage areas can be spotty, and especially in our rural areas in the United States, this can pose obstacles to internet use. Second, there's a lack of training. Currently, the US has no nationwide mandate for digital literacy training in schools. And the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that higher rates of digital exposure doesn't translate into better literacy outcomes. There is an actual need for instruction. We sent everybody home, they were on their computers, and they did not learn how to use them properly. Finally, with the explosion of generative AI, we've now raised challenges in evaluating what is real versus what's AI-generated content. And this has the potential to exacerbate the digital divides we already have. Now, the digital native or the net generation is a concept that a person who has been brought up during the age of digital technology, so those who are considered to be a part of the millennial, Gen Z, or Gen Alpha generations in particular, will be familiar with technology from an early age. However, this is an assumption that is predicated on the incorrect belief that all young people have access to technology. that older people don't have the same level of digital literacy as younger people, and that simply having access to technology means you know how to use it. Importantly, regardless of age, digital literacy primarily should focus on the need to be able to develop socially responsible digital practices and contribute to these practices in one's own professional, work, and learning lives. So, what can cultural heritage institutions do about this? How can we address the decreasing levels of digital literacy and help our communities to build these important skill sets? In June of 2024, the Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services in the United States launched the informationliteracy.gov site, a website designed for specialized tools and resources for museum and library professionals to engage with diverse communities in developing their critical information and digital literacy skills. This was in direct response to the U.S. Congress and White House initiatives in 2022 to improve information literacy across the United States. The Information Literacy Task Force led this work and focused on disseminating training and technical assistant resources for information and cultural heritage professionals. And they reached out to folks who worked in libraries, museums, zoos, aquarium, botanical gardens, arboretums, nature and science centers, archives, and other community serving institutions. As generative AI technology is being integrated into services such as social media, search engines, even into our gaming platforms, dating platforms, and other mainstream applications like Google Spreadsheets, it's more important than ever for the public to have trusted sources of information literacy to guide them through the technology. We want to talk to them about the promises, but also the pitfalls, the biases, and the opportunities that all of this technology offers. In a 2022 report that was co-authored by Slover Lynette here in Chicago, they looked at in-depth surveys of over 75,000 adults across the United States, comprising 500 arts, culture, and community organizations throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Notably, the study showed that the perceived importance of cultural heritage organizations to Americans jumped over the course of the pandemic. Pre-pandemic surveys reflected that less than 1/3 of Americans noted cultural organizations as being important to them. But over the course of the pandemic, 57% of Americans responded that they now viewed arts and culture organizations as important. The same survey found that 76% of Americans wanted their cultural organizations to be active in addressing social issues. This comes along the lines of the Museums Are Not Neutral campaigns that have been running for over the last 10 years. 42% of those polled identified that they want their institutions to talk about systemic racial injustice, but they also want their institutions to address income inequality, followed closely by climate change. Now, the emphasis on lifelong learning and participatory culture demonstrates the strong background that cultural organizations already have to do digital literacy work. It's not just objects housed in collections that matter. The primary value created by institutions for the public exceeds the function of a warehouse, and it instead relies on supporting public learning and education, providing access to cultural assets that inspire creativity, foster identity building, and civic pride. And this is why crowdsourcing also needs to move away from being centered on objects and toward digital literacy as the primary mission. In much the same way that cultural heritage authority is based on the trust of the public, so too is the wisdom of the crowds model that has led to modern crowdsourcing, citizen science, and collaborative community engagement models. If the public does not trust that there's a diversity of thought, an independence in working and thinking, and a decentralized system, then it makes no sense to work in this manner. Looking to science as one of the best examples of the wisdom of the crowd's model of collaboration, and in particular citizen science, it's important to note that the collaboration is imperative because of our specialized nature. Dedicated crowdsourcing platforms such as the Smithsonian Transcription Center, the Library of Congress's By the People, the British Libraries Group, and the multi-institution serving platform like Zooniverse can be seen as novel paths to collaboration between institutions and their audiences. One that prioritizes engagement with lifelong learning by activating curiosity and promoting cultural understandings. However, these projects, which have been operating in cultural spaces for over 20 years, have not been universally adopted without concerns. The resources needed to run these projects have had many people in the field shifting away from running crowdsourcing in favor of experimenting with machine learning and AI models. But AI tagging models have been used by various institutions to expand and enrich existing metadata tags, including at institutions like the San Francisco Museum of Art, Oxford University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, just to name a few. Recently, libraries have keyed into AI technology for tackling the most time-consuming parts of producing library metadata, specifically that of subject cataloging. Researchers have attempted to gauge the ability of OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, and Microsoft's Copilot to produce appropriate Library of Congress subject headings, Library of Congress classifications, and even Dewey Decimal System headings and numbers. In a study by researchers at the Oklahoma State University, the ability of ChatGPT to harvest keywords and assign classification numbers returned underwhelming results, with only a third of produced classification numbers being usable. This included 16% of the classifications created being unreal, hitting on the issue of hallucinations in AI. Now, unlike traditional search that operates on taxonomic matching, modern AI, specifically large language models, generate text by predicting sequences of words. These predictions are based on both observed patterns of the model and also human feedback. And this has begun a process of outputs that are factually wrong, yet linguistically fluent and otherwise seemingly coherent. And this is important to note as we're reaching numbers in the US of about 28% of Americans using generative AI tools at least weekly. Now, a 2019 OCLC research position paper warned 7 years ago that the historic and contemporary biases in cultural heritage that had created the dominantly represented and underrepresented communities could be perpetuated and amplified with the adoption of algorithmic methods. Over the past decade, thousands of scientific studies have also shown how biased AI systems can violate civil and human rights. And though most researchers who focus on ethical AI have focused on the debiasing of data and models and fostering transparency and model fairness, it's also critical to discuss the exploitation of labor in the AI industry, especially as these companies portray their platforms as super intelligent machines with their own agency and decision-making power, obfuscating the real human lives that have been placed at risk to build and run these platforms. Additionally, in 2024 alone, data centers used to power generative AI engines accounted for roughly 2% of global electricity consumption. But it's not just electricity that's concerning. Water usage is also critical to consider. Severe water scarcity already affects 4 billion people worldwide. And when looking at the emissions of data centers between electricity and water consumption, the footprint of AI is now on par with that of the entire aviation industry worldwide. And as climate change continues to be prioritized for the public, it too needs to be considered in the use of cultural heritage institutions. For example, the footprint of the popular crowdsourcing platform Zooniverse.org has a higher than average carbon footprint for a website, but it's still 3 times lower than a single ChatGPT query produces. Already, artificial intelligence and generative AI in particular have been used in the analysis of cultural heritage destruction and recreation of lost artifacts. It's central, however, to keep the citizen science collaborative mindset when projects are using artificial technology, as failing to include local cultures worsens our existing inequalities. However, many examples of case studies already utilizing AI through strong community engagement have proven that by incorporating the community into the projects, AI applications can be culturally representative and inclusive. Maskahani is a grassroots organization whose mission is to strengthen natural language processing research in African languages for Africans by Africans. Almost 7,000 languages are spoken worldwide, and over 2,000 of those are spoken on the African continent. And yet, of the over 130 languages offered by Google Translate, only 13 are native to Africa. Already, the Maskahani Group has built a machine translation tool that allows science communicators to share research across the African continent, creating creating research papers in over 6 languages. And additionally, the Know Our Names project uses an international and multidisciplinary team of researchers to work with the named entity recognition tool for 20 African languages to identify African names, places, and people for information retrieval, adding valuable metadata to increase discovery within the named entity recognition. Now, I want to digress and talk about a project that we ran called Tag Along with Adler. It ran from 2021 to 2022 on the Zooniverse crowdsourcing platform, and it invited the public into the cataloging process of the Adler Planetarium's collections here in Chicago. Not only was community metadata generation encouraged, but a secondary workflow of verifying AI-generated metadata tags was also included as a way to expose users to the emerging AI technology. Tags were generated by AI models, including one created by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and another powered by Google Cloud Vision API, which is the API that underpins the Google image search. It should be noted that the inclusion of AI tags did entice user engagement, and we continuously saw 3 times the engagement with our Verify AI tags workflow over that of our tag images workflow, demonstrating the draw AI automation and algorithms have with users. Additionally, the results from this workflow demonstrated the difference in models and the importance of the selection of AI models in project workflows. About 58% of AI-generated tags for our projects came from the Google Cloud Vision API. Despite accounting for approximately 58% of the total tags generated, the Google Cloud Vision API tags accounted for 86% of the tags verified by volunteers. It demonstrated a strong preference from the volunteers for the visually descriptive language of the Google Cloud Vision API over that of the more museum cataloger language that was prevalent in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's tagger. 18% of all comments that we received from our users on the Talkboard functionality, which is the chat functionality on Zooniverse, were asking for help and clarity around AI programs used in the Verify AI tags workflow. Comments often question the effectiveness of the models to tag collections and served as an effective conversation starter for our staff to engage with the volunteers. As the Association for Colleges and Research Libraries reported in 2025, understanding how AI systems generate information reinforces that no source is inherently authoritative without context. The contention that I have here is that cultural heritage organizations have been sites for mediated, cooperative meaning making for centuries. And as such, they have a unique position in the public trust to use their own biases and limitations as conversations to raise awareness with the public that AI biases and limitations similarly reflect that all information reflects its creator's perspective and purposes, requiring active evaluation rather than passive consumption of information. And this returns to the call from the Institute of Museums and Library Services in 2024 for cultural heritage organizations to take up information literacy. A recent study from researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, their Media Lab, returned concerning results around the way the use of generative AI chatbots, and in particular ChatGPT, harms and degrades critical thinking abilities. MIT looked at Bostonians between the ages of 18 and 39, and the MIT studies found that when asked to write several essays over the course of months, those that were allowed to use OpenAI's ChatGPT in place of nothing at all, or in place of those who were allowed to use search engines such as Google, got lazier with each subsequent essay, often resorting to copy and paste by the end of the study. Not only did use of generative AI tools result in what MIT deemed as laziness, but users also reported increased feelings of loneliness and were noted that their outputs were seen as, quote, soulless. The group that utilized ChatGPT all delivered extremely similar essays, lacking original thought and relying on similar expressions and ideas provided to them by the platform. These recent studies point to an increasing reliance on AI that may increase efficiency in the interim, but it threatens to potentially reduce critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving skills across our workforce. Something that puts the current safeguards of inserting humans in the loop in order to test and effectively fix issues in the AI systems at risk. If humans lose the skills of information literacy, there's no one left to check artificial intelligence on accuracy, let alone issues like bias. So, adopting a mission around using collections items, crowdsourcing projects, and programming to expose digital literacy concepts like bias, algorithms, and more, our institutions have a new ability to become essential. Increasing emphasis and discussion around issues like bias, selection, choice, arrangement, description, and other daily tasks of our institutions helps to demystify many of the unseen processes done by algorithms, including our generative AI models. Studies by the Australian Centre for Evaluation showed that exposure is, in fact, the best inoculation against AI hype. In a study conducted using Microsoft's Copilot, the Australian Centre for Evaluation found that participants in the trial saw an almost tenfold increase in the perception that AI technology was of little to no use. Prior to the trial, 6% believed that the AI was of little to no use, but this soared to 60% post-trial. As 28% of Americans now use AI tools weekly, Americans are also now more likely, at 40%, to say that the effects of AI will be negative, both within society and their own lives. And with the internet's carbon footprint on the rise, now contributing approximately 2 to 4% of global emissions, and an enormous water footprint for cooling centers, now totaling the annual water withdrawal of half of the United Kingdom, it's also imperative for cultural organizations as sites of community engagement to address these very real concerns with their users. Post-pandemic studies show that the public want their cultural heritage organizations to address the matters like climate change, income inequality, and racial injustice. And all of these matters are tied into the ethical decision to use artificial intelligence. And again, bring a strong call for cultural organizations to become active sites for critical literacy building with these emerging technologies.
Wow, so much really relevant and powerful information. Thank you so much for the time you have put together to share this with us. We have learned so much. You see, we have a full packed class room, a conference room, and lots of people taking notes. So everyone, I just want to encourage you to start thinking about questions that you would like to ask. And I will start out by asking, Dr. Bodie Frank, you've shown us what is possible through collaborative, community-engaged digital practice. Looking ahead, what institutional shifts appear most urgent if libraries, museums, and universities are to take on information literacy seriously as a core responsibility, not as an optional skill or add-on?
I would say right now it's a difficult time in general. Obviously, in the United States right now, we're struggling within our cultural heritage spaces. Our funding has been called into question. Our academic freedoms are being called into question. So a lot of that has affected our ability to really engage in any work as we're seeing layoffs and team sizes decrease. And I would say that that's really the major part that we continue to kind of bring back into the conversations, is that this all requires human intervention and labor.
Mhm.
So doing a crowdsourcing project, and as I mentioned, museums have been working with crowdsourcing platforms for over 20 years. And I truly believe that one of the reasons it has not been picked up as a larger portion of what our institutions are doing is because of the work it takes to run these projects. You need people who understand the technical skill sets. So you need people who have Python scripting or know how to do XML coding and can work on the back end of these platforms. And at this point, just even as a aside, the University of Illinois Chicago, we had one digital systems librarian, and when he left, we don't have the budget to refill that position. So now it's on those of us who can try and learn Python scripting on our own to keep those platforms afloat. But if we don't have that infrastructure of an investment, and I think especially for cultural heritage institutions, it's hard to attract folks who have the technical know-how because we don't pay as much in our side of the field. We tend to be slower. We're on academic schedules. So the hiring process can take up to 6 months to fill a position, and somebody can probably get 5 or 6 offers from, the for-profit industry in that time. So it's just a very competitive market for those skill sets. And so it's really a disadvantage to kind of the nonprofit and cultural heritage space. And I think that's what we need more than anything is an investment in those skill sets in our organizations, as well as just an understanding of the need for collaboration, that in order to do a project like this properly, you need educational experts. So the education teams in museums and libraries that have also been cut because now they're not prioritizing tours or school groups or those who are coming on site in person. That cut takes away our ability to understand how do we communicate with folks. When we built the Tag Along with Adler project, which I did with the curation team as well as the citizen science team at the Adler Planetarium, when we first ran the project, it was being recorded at the reading level of somebody with a PhD, which isn't exactly our goal for a project. At the Adler Planetarium, we tried to aim for the US reading level of a fifth grader. So we were I think we had a 12-year miss on that one. And we had to bring in the educational team to say, there are concepts and conversations here that as someone with a PhD in digital humanities or a PhD in astronomy, you think of as being, everyone understands what this term is. But even getting people to understand what metadata is takes time. And it's not something that can be done without including those members of our staff. So I think the collaboration and really just the skill sets are what we're looking for the most in the future. And I would say, in particular, I don't know if anybody wants to hear more about like learn more digital skills, but unfortunately, it's not going anywhere. And now pretty much every person who works in libraries, museums, archives, probably any job needs some kind of understanding of how databases function and how to use and kind of manipulate some of these coding softwares. So I think those are the skill sets that we're desperately missing and need more of in the field.
Well, wonderful. That's so great for the doctoral students and the master students who are in the room to hear. And speaking of them, for the doctoral and master students who will inherit these systems, what capacities, ethical, critical, or collaborative, do you think institutions must prioritize now to prepare scholars, not just to use digital tools, but to intervene in and redesign them responsibly?
Yeah, I think we're struggling at the moment with this problem in particular because so many of our systems have started integrating AI tools without consent. None of us have been addressed. No one's been told. All of a sudden, Zoom has a AI agent that is taking notes in your meeting and sending them out. And I think even just seeing what it produces, it makes people raise a question of what's being recorded, what's being shared, what's being sent around without necessarily opting in. But we're seeing the same thing with our library services. The catalogs are now appending AI agents to, what used to be based off of metadata and taxonomy. And now there's an AI agent. We don't know what the background is. We don't know what it's pulling. We don't know how it's being, what the predictive language is based on. So we've seen this come up with things like JSTOR, or some of the other platforms that are run that have always kind of been a place to, find articles or dig deeper. And now they have these AI agents that no one really understands how it's functioning. And so I think from an ethical standpoint, that's been a large question, is how do we recommend technologies to our students, to our faculty, and even to the public that we don't know what it is doing? And can we actually ethically suggest that to someone when we don't know what they're being served up and given, and we can't actually dig deep under the hood of that technology because there is no ability to, crack into the backside of ChatGPT and see what are they training it on, what are the interventions that have been put in place. None of this information is really public. And so I think that's been a large part of what we've discussed in the cultural heritage space, is that it's really bringing back the importance of library information and digital humanities scholars as experts in information retrieval. So this understanding that right now, when we have folks come to us in the library, they're not coming with a list of books and articles. They're not coming with the, track list that they've received out of JSTOR or wherever to find the items and look through there. They're coming with a prompt that's been written for them from ChatGPT that gives them the answer. And now we're trying to help them verify it with the actual sources. And sometimes sources that come out of those are not real. Like I said, the hallucinations are almost 16 to 20%, are made up sources. And we saw that here in Chicago. Our Chicago Sun-Times, which is one of our major newspapers, ran an article this summer from a publisher that they had received of, the best books coming out for summer 2025. And 2 or 3 of the books were not real. They had been made up by an AI chat bot, but the newspaper never checked it because they received it from Hearst Publications and thought, of course, we'll run it. And so now we're getting all of these places where it's starting to happen pretty consistently throughout our life cycle. So it's not just in the academic spaces, it's in all of our spaces. And so I think having that ability to reference the actual information sources is more important than ever. And so a lot of information staff are now coming back into having to play reference with these things to say you can't just accept things face value. You have to actually look back in. And it very much reminds me of 10 or 15 years ago when we talked about Wikipedia being a problem in the digital humanities space. And oh my gosh, people can write down whatever they want, but they put safeguards in that you had to put your quotations in and you had to cite your sources and you had to be able to track it back. And that's what we're missing from AI right now, is that accountability to be able to track it back.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to open up the floor to our faculty and graduate students who are in the room. If anyone has a question for Dr. Brody Frank, I believe you're going to go to Ebony's computer so that she can hear you clearly.
Yeah, hello.
Oh, there's a bit of an echo.
I'm zero. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I have one question. Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and it is really delightful because we're trying to know what digital humanities is, and this conference is one more conference which is bringing more light to our knowledge about digital humanities. But when I listened to the presentation, one question arose into my mind. What do you think our countries, like African countries, can do to start to get into digitalization of their resources? Because when you mention your hardships and difficulties or issues, concerns that you have in the US, I'm wondering, we Africans, I think we even haven't started yet our, uh, uh, we don't have the materials that are adequate to work with. The human resources are also missing, and there are many, many issues. How can we, at our level, start with our small means? What advice do you have for African countries so far? Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we've seen, even in Chicago, as we mentioned, I'm a member and I help run the Chicago Collections Consortium. So we're a group here in the city of Chicago that works with over 65 of the archives, libraries, museums, and cultural organizations in the city of Chicago. So most of them are community-based organizations that have popped up in neighborhoods that have been historically underrepresented or ignored by our larger organizations when accounting for the history of the city. So they took it upon themselves to start community archiving, basically. And I think that's been a large part of what we've seen from community organizations. So whether it's culturally specific groups popping up throughout the US and other countries to help represent what has been left out of the stronger narratives, community archiving is always kind of step one, is getting people together and deciding that these have been left out, we haven't been considered, let's start doing this work on our own. That's not an easy thing to say, and it's not a simple place to start, but I think that recognition is first and foremost important. I would say for that, in particular, the African continent, it's much more difficult because you were pilfered and things were taken. So many of your objects and these things that we talk about using as entry points or story points, so many museums, libraries, and archives rely on the physical object to start that story, but they took yours. So when they're not in your space, how do you do that? And I think a lot of that conversation has been around repatriation, but also within the digital spaces of things like crowdsourcing or in digital humanities projects of being able to, regardless of where an object is from, have the people who understand what that object is add conversations to it. So in Canada, we've seen it with First Nations groups that have been able to push for the return and repatriation of their objects, but also add to the catalogs and to the conversations of these larger encyclopedic museums and archives throughout the world, where they're putting back in the narrative and the story of what has been left out and missing. In the US, we see it quite often with our native cultures as well, but even in Chicago, I think Chicago is considered the most racially segregated city in the United States. And so when we talk about it from an archives and library museum perspective of keeping the story of our city, the story is usually people who look more like me. So we get a lot of white, Western, European immigrant conversations in Chicago, but we don't always hear from our Hispanic and our Black communities. And so being able to empower those groups is important. But I would say to that question in particular, there is a lot you can do from a community standpoint, but there is also needs to be a recognition that there internationally needs to be a call for more conversations around how we've set up this system to be unfair, and we've made it so that a lot of these are the technologies to do a lot of our cataloging, our systems are expensive, and they're not something that anyone can join in and participate in. And so a lot of our members here in Chicago are using like Google spreadsheets and a Drive folder, and that's the basis of their archiving. And it works in the interim, but that's why we need groups like a consortium that can come in with the software and with the people who know the systems. So I will say those kinds of community built infrastructures are probably first and foremost while we work on the larger systems that have caused this kind of oppression and segregation of our information sources.
Are there particular consortiums that you want to name that they should look into as examples?
I can, if you don't mind, I'll send you an email with a few of them
Okay.
because I'm going to forget because I just know them for like the city names. So
Yeah.
I know we have Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, but there are some in the UK that have been working in particular. Um, Maltaka is out of Oxford University, and they've done a lot of work with the local Arab populations in the Oxford area to help bring context to the objects held by the Oxford University. And so they've been a big one. And then I know I spoke with folks in South Korea, and I can't remember what theirs was called. So I can send you a list so that you can actually get all of those. But there are quite a few. And one place I would say to look in particular is the Association for Critical Heritage Studies. So they hold a biannual meeting, but they do a really good job of looking at the critical heritage side of digital humanities, which is that questioning of why do we do these things? How do we do these things? And kind of what the power source is that we are inheriting as people who live in capitalist or, unfortunately, maybe fascist areas are having to contend with. And so I think Association for Critical Heritage Studies would be a really good one as well.
As you were talking, I was sort of the producer in me was thinking about transcontinental possibilities of these type of consortiums. Like, for example, like the African diaspora is so big, and those of us, for example, in the United States, we are increasingly having this desire to be connected with the African continent and supportive. And oftentimes, because I have spent quite a bit of time in Africa, I often get asked, how can people get involved? And so when you were saying that and crowdsourcing and sharing resources and your imperative around collaboration, it's making me think about just thinking even within the African diaspora, the ways that we, like, for example, in the US, who have access to these resources and who want to be supportive of sharing these resources or access that are causing this, difficulties because you mentioned they're so expensive, et cetera. So maybe we need to sort of be thinking about as well how we can be collaborating and how we can share resources within our own diaspora as well. So I just wanted to add that. Okay, and do we have any other questions in the room?
Go ahead, speaker.
Thank you for your
And turn
presentation.
your camera on, because right now we see Ebony's face. Yeah, we see Ebony's face right now. If you can turn the camera on, we can see your face.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Perfect.
Hi. Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Okay, well, I have one question for you. Uh, do you think African languages can be digitalized. Why? Is there any importance in digitalizing African languages?
Yeah, I would say for sure.
Yeah,
Oops, sorry.
no. Okay. May I take it again? Okay, good. I'm happy you have mentioned the gap between digital illiteracy, okay? And you've mentioned uh, African languages as an opportunity, okay? Good. Now, my question is to know the importance of digitalizing African languages.
Yeah,
Okay?
so yes.
Uh,
I would
uh,
say the importance of digitizing it is, again, to make sure that we are recording things that are ephemeral within our knowledge structures. So we've had projects in the United States and in Canada that have specifically looked at, so it was called the Recovering Languages Project out of the National Anthropological Archives for the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. And this project was specifically looking to try and document the native indigenous languages in the United States because we've reached a point where there are only a handful, if not one person, who still speaks and understands that language. So, in order to make sure that we have access to them within our historical records, we do need to capture them in this moment. So, something like the Mathkahani project out of Africa that's looking to create a natural language processing AI bot that can turn something into right now 6 African dialects is looking to try and capture that information. So whether it's going into an AI bot or it's being digitized and stored as part of that language. So the Recovering Voices project at the Smithsonian predated the AI kind of craze. So they didn't put anything into an AI bot, but they've just basically created a very large database of hundreds of indigenous languages. And part of the importance of that is also when we look at history, culture, meaning making, it's all contingent on time, it's all contingent on our understandings and places. So people can go back and question uh, I forgot the word just fell out of my head when you translations. Thank you. Okay. So I think I saw an example of this happening even, outside of what we're talking about, but there's a lot of talk about the Odyssey as a Greek, Homer wrote this great Odyssey. They're turning it into a large budget movie next year. And there's one woman who is a scholar in Canada who had revisited the translation and has found that based off of the certain words you translated, it's a very different story. And so just those ideas of revisiting our history, it's never closed. We're never done with something. We always have to look back on it. And this is where that critical heritage comes into place. We always have to look back on it with the eye of who was allowed to talk about it, who looked into it, what was their purpose or mission around it. And if you want to look at original source material and be able to understand that, you need to know the language. And so I think keeping track and having written and in certain ways living documents of those languages is more important than ever because if you can't come back and say that's not what that meant, somebody will always be able to say, well, prove it. And if you can't, then you're kind of stuck. So I think those are the importance of, and again, the necessity of engaging with the community and the people because we need to understand the nuances of what this meant to somebody who is a natural speaker versus somebody who's an academic 250 years later trying to look back at that language.
I love that. It's really, drives home this idea that digital humanities is always engaging with the past in the present, but mindful and thoughtful about the future as well. We have another question. Okay. You are muted, so unmute.
Madam Jessica, Madam Jessica, thank you for your presentation. In your presentation, you mentioned the use of AI. I would like to ask the question to know that how, as a student, can you use AI without reducing our critical thinking? Thank you.
No problem. So I think I mentioned it briefly, but something that we've been using is called human in the loop. So this came out of the Library of Congress, has kind of coined this phrase, human in the loop. And it's this idea that you still always need to reinsert a person into the process of AI. So when they looked at the studies for MIT, that was something that I thought was important that they did run is they had taken Bostonians from the ages of 18 to 39, asked them to write these essay prompts, and they had three different groups. So they had a group who could only do it on their own, kind of by themselves with just their computer, not looking at any resources. They had a group that was able to use search engines like Google. And then the third group used ChatGPT. And the problem that they saw was with the ChatGPT only group. And that was because that was a group that was being fed answers, not sources. So when you're using something like Google, I think people tend to assume we're getting an answer out of Google, but what you're really doing is just being fed the source. You're being shown what you can find the answer within yourself, whereas ChatGPT takes that part out. So that's what's degrading the critical thinking side of things is that we're getting to the point where you're no longer having to read it yourself, parse out that information, kind of take it in and process it. You're just being told an answer. And so I think when you're looking at using AI, it is a really helpful tool. And it's something we're not telling people wholesale to ignore or not use at all, but just be mindful of what you're asking it to do for you, as well as when you're getting the results, verify. So it was the same thing they told us 15 years ago when we used to write using Wikipedia that, it's your responsibility to go and verify what you're going to say. In the same way, if you asked your grandmother or your auntie for a question and she gives you an answer on, how to beat the common cold, I'm still going to double check that because my auntie has told me some interesting things before, but I can believe it. Once you tell somebody else that information, though, you've endorsed it as the answer. So you want to make sure that you can put behind it that you know that that answer is correct, or at least you're referencing where you got that work from. So it's really just a matter of showing your work, I think, will help make sure that you're not losing that critical thinking skill. And again, just as we said, I think they said hallucinations in the AI models for ChatGPT have only gotten worse. And the articles that have come out from the OpenAI team on the ChatGPT models have said that they don't expect them to get better because the way these systems are built to be predictive and not matching is basically the system itself is being rewarded for coming up with an answer, whether or not it's right. It's not based on being factual. It's based on I gave you an answer and it sounded okay. So a lot of it is just being aware of that and using the technology the way you have to use it for the pitfalls that it currently has.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brody Frank, and I want to honor your time. So I'm going to go ahead and close us out. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and your interest in this really captivating presentation. And as we close, I want to underscore a few ideas that feel especially important to carry forward from this presentation. Today reminded us that collaboration is not optional in digital humanities, it is essential. Because knowledge is specialized and unevenly distributed, ethical digital work depends on making space for multiple forms of expertise and lived knowledge to enter the process. We also heard a clear challenge to the assumptions often embedded in digital systems about access, engagement, neutrality, relevance. Information literacy matters because it allows us to see bias, question authority, and take responsibility for how digital knowledge is organized and shared. Looking ahead, the stakes only increase as AI systems rely on existing archives and metadata. The decisions we make now about description, participation, and inclusion will shape future knowledge systems. This places responsibility not only on individuals, but on institutions. Digital humanities is not just technology, it is a responsibility. Thank you all for your engagement today. Thank you so much for your presentation and participation in our speaker series, Dr. Bodhi Feng. And everyone,
Thank you so much for having me.
thank you.